So the next question is, what are some of the obstacles, both internal and external, that we face when building these institutions upon an equitable framework? And I do want to turn it back to you, but because I didn't respond to the last question, I want to respond to the last question and this one together.
Sure.
And I'm going to come to it from a specific place, which is, I am of an ethnicity that does not fit into any ethnically specific community or contemporary art institutions in the United States. In New York, there are enough of us, perhaps, to create a cultural center, maybe. Other places, not so much. And so we get put in the category of Asian. Now, you said, imagine how difficult it is to tell all the stories of the peoples of the American West. There are 2.5 billion people living in Asia. So what is an Asian culturally specific institution? Well, it's actually not anything. It's usually whichever is the biggest group that has the clout in that particular region of the United States where this Asian institution has been created. So in New York, Asian sometimes refers to South Asians. In most of the rest of the US, it refers primarily to people from eastern parts of Asia. And so I actually have never encountered a culturally specific institution that reflects me. I also come from a specific constituency, South Asians, which is incredibly fractious, and where the definition of who we are is constantly in contention in our countries of origin, which are at war with one another. So these dynamics are also replicated within our culturally specific spaces. We have hard right religious agendas that often govern our culturally specific spaces. So my response to that has been, I don't work in culturally specific spaces. I don't see myself in those spaces. And the reason I wanted to bring that up was actually to build on what Betty was saying about how you become a feeder for artists from a community into opportunities that are not culturally specific. And I think that because I don't have a culturally specific home of my own in contemporary arts in the United States, and certainly not on the West Coast, I have actually had to create a space for myself professionally of being that connector between the culturally specific and the quote-unquote mainstream. And that's been a big part of the way I've sort of defined myself in my role as a curator, which I also think is an educator role. So with that, I'll turn it back to Robyn.
That is very much where we were headed with not only being realistic about how long change will take, making sure your leadership is understanding of how long that will take, making the long-term commitment, but also figuring out what kind of an institution you're in. Are you an individual contributor? Are you an institution who is serving as the bridge? Are you a larger institution that can host these other opportunities? And then work within what your institution is and can do best, and make sure that you're working in a place that fulfills you personally. Would you be more comfortable in a grassroots organization, in a small organization? Would you be more comfortable in a large institution? Do you feel like you can make the best contributions there? So that would be, I don't think it's a bad thing that self-help is who they are and does what they do. I think it's a fantastic thing, and I know we at the AUTRY have invited self-help in on several different occasions throughout the years to do what you do well, which is not what we do well. And to answer the question, sort of at the beginning of every planning process for public programming, is this program by a community for that community? Is this program by a community for a larger community? Because the approaches are different in both cases.
I think another thing that's really difficult, and this doesn't matter whether you're at a small institution, large institution, major city, smaller city, is that we don't all have the same understanding of what this work is supposed to look like. So everyone's just trying to operate with the limited knowledge they have, and some people are very invested in it, so we read and we engage and we try things out and don't get discouraged if things don't pan out. But some of us are also a lot more risk averse about it. And I have found the most difficult thing to be for everyone to be on the same page about what we're actually talking about. Because there will always be people that are like, well, that's a little too much, or that's a little too risky, or we're only going to talk about stereotypes, we're not going to talk about justice. You know, so there's always someone who's kind of trying to pull it back instead of actually what I call justice work. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think
a lot about one word, recognition. And who gets recognition when that program that is wildly successful, that engages with all of those communities, you know, where are the people who are putting in that work being celebrated for the work that's being done? And I think that is something that is extremely important. And speaking from personal experience, you have to be a part of your own advocating for that. It's difficult, especially when people tell you that you need to ask your leadership for permission, or you need to, you know, sort of pitch your way up. Do the work. Make sure that your communities are seeing you do the work, and continue to be in conversation with those people, because those are the people that in the end, I think, really raise you up, and keep you moving forward and keep you pushing towards the goals you're actually trying to achieve, rather than the goals that sometimes may be what you're being told by leadership to do. I always would sort of think about the work that I did similar to you in a way of, like, I'm a translator between worlds. You know, I will get very specific and candid with you. You know, working here at the Skirball, I had an opportunity to help plan a portion of our Hanukkah festival. And when you think Hanukkah, you don't necessarily think African-American djembe beating dancers, singers, and Hanukkah. And it was important for me to show the diversity of perspectives, the diversity of joy in religious experience and in just community experience. And so that was something that I pushed forward to make sure that we had an opportunity to just engage different communities. And I think that becoming a translator between whatever your own personal narrative is, whatever your own world is, and the work that you want to keep pushing forward, that can make a world of difference for the people coming into the space that you're trying to sort of provide more access towards, rather than always thinking straight from, this is what I'm tasked to do, if that makes any sense.
So looking at this from an internal perspective, I think it's really important to acknowledge the power dynamic that exists within organizations, large and small. And when you're thinking about larger institutions, the general reality is that leadership tends to be white and more male. And then it's the lower sort of level staff that end up becoming more diverse. You see more diversity in that pool, and especially in museums, you'll see it a lot in terms of like the gallery attendants and security. Like that's like your most diverse department. And it's so interesting to me that right now in this moment, as museums and cultural organizations are looking at diversity and equity, and there's a lot of, I think, sort of looking outward. And there's an incredible pool of perspectives and people within the organizations already. And I found this actually during my time at the Music Center. You know, the thinking financially, a lot of older white donors are passing away. So their money's slowly going. And as we think about, okay, well, what's the sort of sustainability long-term of these major institutions? We have to tap into the Latino population. We have to tap into the people of color population of LA County. How do we do that? How do we better reach out to them? And it's like, hey, we have a 200-person staff that deals with people coming in and out of the space every day, and they're all mostly millennial people of color. And that's who we're trying to tap into. And it was a sort of like light bulb moment of like, oh shit, they're right here. And I think that we don't even go there because we're not thinking about the way that the hierarchy actually limits even our thinking about how we look at our own team.
And I think there's a huge focus on, let's reach out, let's reach out. They're the magical unicorns. They exist out here. They're not in our world. And I think that it's not about reaching out. It's seriously about creating a welcome environment for people to want to bother walking by, let alone going in. And if you don't have that environment, or, you know, if you're not looking in order to develop your best self externally, then there aren't going to be people attracted to you. And so that's just something that I think as organizations, you have to look inward before you ever think you're going to reach out.
I would totally agree with that. And I would also add, in terms of obstacles and challenges, a big challenge that we face, certainly at my institution, I think all of us face, is a lot of times diversity and equity are treated as projects, right, as opposed to lifelong commitments. And so I think where a lot of the culturally specific organizations struggle, and frankly probably all cultural institutions or most do, is with operating costs and unrestricted support. And that a lot of times the institutions and individuals that are most capable of providing that support have a very short-term approach to equity building. That's not what when we do this work, we learn very quickly that it has to be a long-term approach. So just to use our cultural asset map as an example, we had a really fantastic opportunity with this Irvine grant and support with the California Arts Council to get this going. And it carried us through the first 3 years of the project, and we were able to be really successful. But we also discovered how much more work we have to do. And we don't have a consistent revenue stream at this moment to continue to support that. So even when we are creating as best we can spaces within our organization to bring the community in, you know, staff positions for community outreach work that are non-contract based, for example, that include benefits and, you know, sufficient pay. That's a struggle that we don't have the resources to meet. And so even with our intentions, and we have the people, we worry now that we're actually going to lose some of that ground. And similarly, what we found is that once you tell the people, hey, we're here for you, we want you to come in, they want to come in. And then it's like, well, do we have space for you? You know, and like we're finding we just need a flexible community room where we can offer it to people. But again, that takes operating money that we need to find somewhere. And so, I mean, in a way, this is an appeal, because I know that this is going out through AAMD and through these channels of, you know, professionals in the field who have influence, to say, if you really want to see the field diversify, you have to stop treating equity like a project. And the priority has to be in making staffing and employment in this field actually sustainable for the diverse professionals who are in it, so that they can make it to mid-career and above. It's very simple.
Yeah, I really agree with that, because even at the culturally specific museum I was in before, we didn't have a diversity problem. We had hundreds of people who wanted to come work with us, had their master's degree, MFAs, they were all bilingual, they had everything you could possibly need that every major museum says, why can't we have a diverse staff? But we could only hire them for contract work, or if there was a full-time position, then how much could they possibly be making? Like high 30s maybe, if they had some experience. So then you have all these very, very highly motivated young people who have all this experience wanting to come into your institution, but you not being able to support them in their growth. And then they just go somewhere else. They become very disillusioned for a lot of reasons, like we exploit them and all their time. We exploit their expertise and not pay them adequately. And that's really difficult for our field. We're totally losing all these very talented young professionals.
Not so young as well.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, that is very true too.
So, okay, the last question. What are some strategies that you've utilized to increase your impact, and now we're speaking more individually as practitioners, and connect with peers of color in the field, or peers who are contributing to the presence of people of color in the field, and while working toward change in the institutions where you work? So I think this is where we can talk a little bit about how we work institutionally, but also how we do other professional activities such as this panel that we're on right now to advance the cause?
Oh, I'll go. So I'm a part of an organization called WOCA, Women of Color in the Arts, and it's a national organization, but what's interesting about it is I believe they put a lot of focus on women of color who are working in the presenting arts field, or specifically performing arts. And so as I was getting involved with the organization and hosted a couple of events out here in LA, I found myself wanting to broaden that scope of women of color who work in the arts. And so just like made a Facebook group, and it's got the longest name ever, but it's basically a online sisterhood, a community for all women of color who work in anything arts focused, specifically if they identify as an administrator. And the network is based as just kind of a place to share opportunities, new jobs, resources, venting. You know, this has happened in where I'm at, and I just need advice on how to handle this situation. You know, I specifically made it a place not to post about your events because we got enough of that already. And I think that there's an importance in just allowing people to be open with difficulty, and knowing that there are other people who are going through similar things is healthy. It's healthy to talk about vulnerable aspects of work and of where sort of your personal mission conflicts with your professional aspirations or professional visions. And so that's kind of what I've done. And then I also was a part of the Cultural Equity and Inclusion Initiative, the committee for that when it the first iteration of it, and I'm now doing that again in order.
Does everyone know what that is? Can you just explain real quick what that is?
Well, I think Betty and I. So Betty and I were both a part of this Cultural Equity and Inclusion Initiative, which was shepherded by the LA County Board of Supervisors. And then the LA County Arts Commission decided to really sort of ramp things up. And there have been a lot of stages of it over the course of the last 3 to 4 years. And the result of the first 2.5 years were this list of recommendations that went to the LA County Board of Supervisors that were approved to enhance cultural equity initiatives throughout Los Angeles County. So the fact that like all arts and cultural institutions now need to adopt a EDI statement. That's something that the LA County is now requiring in order to fund institutions in the future. Recently, the arts internship program expanded its opportunities for students in community colleges to have arts internships through that program. So that was another recommendation that was approved and that was funded by the Board of Supervisors. And so there's all these different stages that have sort of occurred through it. And now that the LA County Arts Commission is going to become an official department, which is awesome, of the county, similar to like library and sheriff, like we're very different, but
what if we had art police?
Yes, we're going to be art police, and it's going to be awesome, and that's why I'm continuing being on this committee, so I can keep that advocacy efforts moving forward. I don't know if you want to talk anything about that, Betty, too.
Yeah, I'm not continuing actually as part of that committee, and purposefully. I think it was a hard process, but I'm really glad that I was part of it. Mm-hmm. But there were even within that where like this group of people, this committee was brought together with very specific goals, the sort of power dynamics and existing power structures were still really entrenched even in that space.
Yes.
But for me, I've also, like Elena, really sought out just individually connecting with my peers. Elena and I were also part of group that was, I don't even know what it was called.
We didn't call it anything. We just met.
Yeah, so it was
We
a bunch of women of color who worked in the arts, but and really like all kinds of arts backgrounds. But I think the idea of just sort of finding a group of people that you can connect with outside of your workspace, and to like sort of be able to say whatever you want to say without having to put on your diplomatic filter. And beyond venting, I think a lot of what we did was really focusing on sort of finding solutions to some of the challenges that we were having individually. But I also want to share, just as a woman of color in the arts, as a millennial, realizing early on that I wasn't going to be getting the kind of support that I wanted in building my own leadership skills. I had to seek that out in other ways. So I was part of a board that had nothing to do with the arts, but it was part of a working board around supporting people who walk and bike and take public transit in the city. And I found the connections to my work in building these amazing, vibrant communities. But it was within that space that I really built up the kind of leadership skills that would then get me my current position. So in a way, it's almost like you just can't wait. You just got to go and find where your skills are valued. And I was actually recruited for that. Some of the other board members who were part of that, who I knew were like, ooh, you do nonprofit administration, yes. And it ended up being an incredible opportunity for me. So yeah, just seeking out other ways to grow individually.
I really want to echo this whole thing of coming together as a collective. When I was in New York City, Kiana Hendricks started this collective of cultural workers. We worked pretty much all across the board, fundraisers, marketing, educators. But really it was a way, we weren't venting, but it was more that it was a place where we could talk about all of the issues that were plaguing our institutions that we could not necessarily talk institutionally about because of all the power dynamics, because we still needed to get paid and get a paycheck, and all those very important things about surviving in New York. And also, in the same here in Los Angeles, it's a very small community where you don't want to say the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong time. So the beautiful thing about that collective, which is still happening, is that we all took turns to run professional development for each other. So Monica Octavia was also part of that group. She taught us how to brand ourselves. She was the person who told me, she was like, don't give institutions all of your brilliance. You have to keep some of it for yourself. So, and we had professional development on poetics and how do you analyze text? How do you analyze poetry in order to be able to really survive in these contexts that weren't necessarily meant for us? We were mostly Black women and women of color. So like this organizing perspective and this horizontal leadership where we all contribute something to the table is incredibly empowering. And I think that that is really where the power is. And then we bring ourselves into the institution and fortified, hopefully, to tackle these big organizational structures, and that's so important, to be fortified.
It is a journey, it is not a destination. All of your career, you will be seeking out peers and mentors to figure out what support you need for this part of your journey. I'm older than probably most of the people in this room. I have achieved a lot of really great things in my career that I am proud of, and I have risen to a leadership position where I hope that I can make a difference. And for myself, someone asked me when you first got here, how long have you been in the job you're in now? And it's been 11 years. And in that 11 years, the journey that I have been on is learning to transition from what am I doing to how am I enabling the next generation to go and do. The flippant answer is my job is now to go out and raise money so I can pay other people to do the thing that I love.
That's management for you.
That is management for you. But learning to find fulfillment in that, because I can, in these remaining years of my career, make so much more meaningful change in my community by empowering a whole herd of people to come after me than by trying to do the one last thing myself.
Yeah, I think that's really very inspiring and very true. For my part, I would say, to add just to the great, insights that we've heard here, firing on all cylinders. A job is a job, and no matter how much you love your job and no matter how much your job needs you, you can't give it all your brilliance. You have to keep something for yourself. And so I think also there's only so much you can do in any job, because you have your agenda and the agenda of the institution have to align. So anything that doesn't fit in the Venn diagram between the two, you can't do it in the job. You have to do it some other way. So for my part, in this past year, I published my first book, which was a compilation of essays I'd written over the previous 5 years, because I'm also a parent, so that's how I have to write. And I was fortunate that my publishers were 2 women of color, and when I proposed to them that what I really wanted for my own professional development after contributing in this online forum for 5 years was for them to put the resources behind publishing my texts as a book that could circulate in a scholarly arena, they were right on board, and they had never done a book before. So they created an opportunity, but I had to see my way to it. I had to propose it and ask for it. And so opportunities don't just come, even when you're in the right circumstances. I mean, you still have to kind of help shape and guide them. And the book for me has been really important because it's circulating way beyond where I individually can. And I think so much of this diversity and equity work that I do is very much person to person. It's about opening the door to a way of thinking that I believe contemporary art facilitates, that I believe is really healthy for people to engage in, and that I want all people to be able to access. And then it's about opening the minds of people who control a lot of resources and don't necessarily believe that other people could be trusted with them, to help them understand that, in fact, trust is paramount to building a better future. And so having a book really helps me personally to do that on a much bigger scale than the one-on-one scale that I tend to activate. But that said, one-on-one is where the magic happens. And so with artist residency, it is about this kind of slow art experience. It's not how many people can see the next Picasso. It's, did you get a chance to sit and have lunch with someone who might be the next Picasso? That's a special thing. And in the same way, mentorship is one-to-one. So like I participate as a mentor in EALLA, which you mentioned.
Protege represent.
Right, and so that's something I think many of you could also consider, College Art Association, where I serve on the board, which gives me an international platform to try to advance policy. So I chair the museums committee, and I work with other curators in art centers, museums, big museums, academic university institutions, art historians who have an interest in museum work. And we work together to actually try to make policy recommendations for how diversity and equity can advance in terms of people's careers in the field. And so these are things I can't do in my small institution. And at the same time, for me as a professional, they enable me to develop skills working in institutions with a much larger budget size than I have so far been able to be employed at. And so that also then keeps my professional options broad in a way that I would encourage everyone to do. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do where we are using our energies and our time in a very focused manner to both maximize the opportunities we're sharing with others and also always have a mind to how we're creating opportunities for ourselves. Because the truth is, if you put your whole life into serving other people and you don't take care of yourself, that's also not a really good position to be in, and that leads to a lot of resentment and frustration. So I think we've all learned over the years and from our peers and our mentors that you have to take some for yourself and give some to others at the same time. Any parting thoughts before we wrap?
I think that's a beautiful thought to end on. Pay yourself first.
Yeah, yeah, put your mask on first, then help other people. Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. This has really been a pleasure.
So a lot of people have brought up the idea that if we're going to be inclusive and diverse, that it can't be an initiative-funded project. I think a lot of people in this room aren't the funders or don't work in grants or reviewing grants. Is there a boots-on-the-ground solution for this, or is it really a kind of funding problem?
I think like any other aspect of our democracy, we have a little bit of a pipeline problem where the resources are collected at the top and the voices of the many have a difficult time gaining the ear of the few. But I think like any other practice in a democracy, it's really about activism. So I would say that the pocketbooks will release if the people demand it.
What she said.
I also think that I think that there are certain leaders within our field that are already thinking this way, and they can influence each other and influence, going to the top. So there's grassroots level work, but who is it? There was just the name just escaped me, but there is a head of a big foundation that is talking about justice work. It'll come to me, but that there are foundations that are thinking about how they give out money, and they have to influence themselves as well. I know it's not very coherent, but there are people who are already thinking this way.
I do think that the public conversation around these issues has caused them to start to think this way.
for
So it's
sure.
definitely true that the voices of the many do trickle up. They just have to be really loud.
Exactly. And like, how are you making your voice heard? Just think about that. For me, when I was graduating grad school, it was very important to me. I really had this revelation about there's a lack of diversity in leaders in arts and executive positions specifically, and it bugged the heck out of me. So I decided to make my thesis project that. And I interviewed over 25 different arts and cultural leaders, and I wrote a whole article that went on HowlAround specifically talking about the lack of representation of people of color in executive leadership positions. Boom. Then I had leaders come and talking to me, hey, you want to talk about that? Yes, I do. So, you also have to think about what is your version of that? And where are you writing? Where are you talking? Where are you sitting? You can create those opportunities for yourself. And Emerging Arts Leaders was a great opportunity for me to start doing that for myself before other people decided that I should have a seat at the table. I made my own seat at the table. So start to figure out where you can create your own table.
We had another question, I think, gentleman in blue.
Yeah, I think actually it's rolling off of what you're saying right now, because you were using a lot of keywords I feel like I've heard before, this idea of like cultural spaces or who's being represented and things like that. So I think it's easy to do like this, we make our own type of thing, as you were saying. But my question was like, what actually distinguishes a culturally specific museum or an experience versus something that is non-culturally? Like, what is a LACMA or a museum that doesn't necessarily say I'm representing this race? What kind of keywords can you add to that? Like, how do we call it what we see?
All right, can I give you the provocative answer? I think
Yeah,
that
I want that.
when we say an institution is not culturally specific, usually what we mean is it's culturally specific to whiteness. So that's a problem that we have, because we have this coded language where only certain communities are identified as culturally specific, and others who may have a similar degree of representation in leadership of an institution aren't treated as culturally specific. But that said, I would say, like when I talk about my institution, 8th Street, not being culturally specific, I want to be clear and say that I don't think that we are a white institution either. What we're trying to do is have a table that has enough seats around it for everyone to be included. And we're trying to do that at the leadership level, and that really comes to diversifying our board at this point. We have a pretty diverse staff, we have a pretty diverse constituency, and we do have a diverse board, but those are the areas where we really can grow. And actually the CEII that was mentioned that the LA County Arts Commission put forward is helpful in that regard, because it helps us see both where we're good and where we need to grow.
I just really quickly want to add, yes, absolutely, about the mainstream culture, white culture. But I think there's also an opportunity, like LA County Museum of Art, we know what the geographic boundaries are of that. And then other museums have different communities that they are seeking to serve. But if you're looking at the county, it's like, well, we're not a culturally specific organization. Let's talk about the makeup of the county, and let's talk about how the demographics of the county are represented in the space. So there's a little bit of an opportunity that I see in leveraging that to leadership, because then they can't really fight you on it, or they shouldn't.
Yeah, and I think I see it at kind of multiple levels, because there's culturally specific to what, and usually at many major institutions, it's like, oh, well, we have a Kehinde Wiley show, so that's why we have all the Black people coming to our museum, or we have a Mexican painting show, that's why we have bilingual text.
For that month.
Right. So I think that we even think culturally specific at that like exhibition level, or even thinking about what if we have different spaces somewhere else, like what kind of shows we put in those spaces. Like there's this delicate balance between, yeah, we definitely want the community members to enjoy the art on view, but that doesn't necessarily mean we always have to talk about slavery. Or like there's only going to be a show on slavery because that's, I don't know, this community has African Americans around it. So like what is that balance, and who gets to choose what goes on the walls?
As our CEO at the AUTRY Museum likes to put it, we are a post-hyphenated museum. We are not of any particular culture, although we do have in our collection holdings one of the largest collections of Native American art and artifacts in the United States, second only to the Smithsonian. But we're not a Native American museum. We are a post-hyphenated museum. What does that mean? That is a dialogue that we have internally every single day. The dialogue never stops, and I hope that it never does, because that's what keeps us fresh and relevant to what's going on in the world today.
Decolonizing is an action. It's a verb. It has to happen all the time, over and over again.
I want to thank the panelists, because we're running out of time. If you guys have other questions, feel free to mingle in this break. But before we take a break, I want to encourage you. I love all the love for emerging arts leaders, but also if you want to participate in MESC and maybe suggest programming for us, please connect with us.